MySQL is an open source relational database solution. It's been around for quite a while. But the great thing about working with RDS, with relational database services in the Amazon Web Services cloud, is that all of the underlying work is done for you. That means there's no need to manually provision virtual machines that you then would install the MySQL database server software on. That part is all done for you. Instead, you focus on what databases are supposed to do: store data efficiently and allow the querying of that data. So to get started here in the AWS Management Console, I'm going to search for RDS, and then I'll click on that to open up the RDS Management Console. And on the dashboard landing page, I'm going to go ahead and click Create Database. You can choose Standard Create, where you get to specify some config details, such as those that are related to security, backup schedules, maintenance windows, or you can just choose Easy Create and use best practice configs, and then you can change them after it's created if you so choose. I'm going to leave it on Standard Create. Down below, the engine we're interested in, of course, is MySQL. Now, why would you choose MySQL over Microsoft SQL Server? Well, Microsoft SQL Server is proprietary and you have to purchase licenses. You don't have to do that for MySQL, and you might be familiar with MySQL, or you might have an app that needs to use a MySQL database in the back end. So there are many reasons that we choose one relational database solution over another. So MySQL it is. Now, of course, down below, it states that we're using MySQL Community Edition. Okay, that's great. Don't have to pay, at least for the MySQL component itself. You're going to have to pay for having it running in the Amazon Web Services cloud, though. You get to choose the version of the MySQL engine. This could be important depending on the feature set that you want to take advantage of. So I'll leave it on the latest version, MySQL 8.0.28. Then a template. Do we want to use a production set of options for fast, consistent performance, or dev testing, or just free tier usage? And if you wanted to know what the free tier selection would include, you can just click Info and you'll see the number of hours that you can run in a single availability zone, the amount of storage and the type, backup details. So I'm going to go ahead and choose free tier in this particular case. So down below, a lot of the options are grayed out because of that selection, like the multi-availability zone cluster settings. Now for high availability, depending on how this database will be used, that might be very important, and so you might want to use dev test or production. If I go to dev test, those become available. Same thing is true with production as a template. But back to free tier, down below it wants a database instance identifier. I'll leave the default value of database-1. It wants credential settings. The default username is admin. I'll specify and confirm the master password. And then I have the DB instance selection. Many of them are grayed out again because I'm using the free tier. But this is important because you have to right size it. You have to make sure you have the appropriate amount of virtual CPUs and RAM and potential network throughput available for the workload that will be supported by this. You can always change this after the fact. Here's the storage, 20 gig, and I'll leave storage auto scaling enabled so that if we need more space, then the space will be allocated as needed, up to a maximum of, in this case, 1000 gig. Connectivity over the network will be IPv4, but you could choose a dual stack for IPv4 and IPv6. I'll leave it set to use my default VPC. Down below, I'm going to choose yes for public access because I want to be able to use tools from an on-premises computer to reach into AWS to manage MySQL. For example, we'll be using MySQL Workbench. But that connectivity will show up in another demo. I'm going to choose to create a new VPC security group. I'll call it MySQL Security Group. And in additional configuration, the listening port for MySQL is normally 3306. I'm okay with that. I'll leave it. Database authentication is just standard password authentication. Under additional configuration, this is where we could specify things like whether automated backups are enabled and for how many days backups are retained, and whether we want to enable encryption. Notice that these things are all turned on by default. We can also turn on deletion protection as an additional layer of security against accidental deletion of this database. And then finally, in the bottom right, I'm going to go ahead and choose Create Database. All right, and before too long, we'll have a message at the top that states that it successfully created our database. It's called Database 1, and if I scroll over, it's a MySQL Community Edition configuration, and the status is available. Now, if I click on the link for the database identifier, that opens up its properties. I can get a listing of things like the number of concurrent connections, CPU activity, the database class, the region it was deployed into, and I can click the Modify button if I need to make some changes to the config of this. So we're presented with our options, like maybe setting a new master password, or changing the size, changing storage settings, auto-scaling, all of the same stuff that we saw upon creation. I'm just going to click to close that and go back to databases. Let's go back in and just view the details of the database. Down below, under connectivity and security, we've got our DNS endpoint for connection purposes over port 3306. Notice that public accessibility is set to yes, so that if I wanted to, I could manage this instance over the internet from on-premises. Depending on your security requirements, that might be unacceptable. You might only leave it private so that you have to, for example, VPN into the AWS cloud first before you can get connectivity. Then down below, I can click on the Monitoring tab to monitor some performance metrics related to this database instance. I can go to Logs and Events to view log activity. I can go to Configuration, which gives us a summary of what we had configured, and we know that we can modify these settings. Maintenance and Backups, which we know is on by default, but we can configure it otherwise. And finally, we can add up to 50 key value tag pairs as metadata for this database. If I go back to the databases view and select the database with the radio button on the left, under Actions, I can choose to stop the database, reboot it, delete it, which is important if you're only testing and then you're finished with the testing, stop it, and ideally, if you know you won't need it, delete it. Otherwise, you're still incurring charges. Even if it's stopped, you're incurring storage charges. You can create a read replica for high availability. You can take a snapshot and you can restore it to an earlier point in time because backups are enabled by default.